The United States has reopened its embassy in Kyiv 3 months after it closed just before the Russian invasion. The American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, welcomed the news of the stars and stripes flying over the embassy again. Meanwhile, elsewhere, 1,000 Ukrainian fighters are reported to have left the Mariupol steelworks, where they've been besieged for weeks. Russian forces appear to control the city. Well, let's get more on the conflict and NATO's response to it. We can speak to Rose Gottemoeller, who's a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and a former United States Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Good evening to you, Rose.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Great to have you with us. First of all, how important a move do you think it is, even if only a symbolic one, that the United States has reopened its embassy in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv?
Oh, I think it's an absolutely necessary step. The U.S. presence in Kyiv, particularly its leadership role in the NATO alliance and its leadership role in supporting Ukraine's war efforts, as well as the humanitarian assistance effort, means that this is far more than a symbolic move. This is actually getting U.S. leadership back on the ground in a way that I think will be very helpful to President Zelensky and his government and will really help to facilitate the flow of assistance.
So you mean if you've actually got American personnel there on the ground, they can liaise much more closely with Zelensky's government about what it needs and when it needs the military equipment to arrive?
Absolutely. Of course, the president is right at the top of the government and the most important, but it's really about being able to talk to people in every layer of government, in the Ministry of Defense, in other agencies that are dealing with the health problems that have become so rife as the medical system has taken a pounding, really just across the spectrum of the kinds of aid and assistance that Ukraine will need. So I'm very pleased to see this step taken.
We're seeing a mixed picture when it comes to the progress of the war. Russian forces may not be making the progress they'd like over the east, but they are still apparently taking more territory. And it now seems as though that last stand taken by Ukrainian fighters in the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol has finally ended, with up to 1,000 people now taken out of that site. How significant a move do you think that is?
We've known for some time that Mariupol was falling under the control of the Russians. They had taken over the city administration, so to say, some time ago. So it really was a last stand at the steelworks that was so heroic, surrounded on all sides by the Russians, and also apparently with a Ukrainian double dealer, a traitor who let Russians into some secret underground tunnels to better give them access. So there's been, I would say, a very heroic stand that's gone on for several months now, but they have finally now, it appears, decided to end that stand and conclude it. So I think it does mean that this is one of the top goals that Vladimir Putin had, to acquire Mariupol, to have that land bridge between the Donbas and Crimea, and also to take over control of the Azov Sea. So this is an important goal that Putin had laid out. But the Russians are falling back in other places, and including being driven out of the northeast of the country, out of the area around Kharkiv. So I think the momentum is still very much on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, but it is quite a moment, isn't it? Because, as you say, this is part of President Putin's overall strategic aims to link up those parts of the east of Ukraine which it controls down to the southern part of the country, the seaports and Crimea itself. And now that it does apparently, if not completely, control Mariupol, that is a significant gain after weeks of setbacks.
Well, again, we've seen it coming, and I think it's been so tragic for the civilian population in Mariupol who have experienced so many deaths and so many injuries, including we hardly can think about it now. But the attack on the maternity hospital back at the beginning of March, that was just the first in what seems to be a string of atrocities that have taken place in Mariupol. So it's taken on a very large symbolism. But yes, it is in fact one of the strategic goals of the Russian Federation. I think we have to look at the big picture, however, and that is in other ways, the Russian side is losing big. The notion that now Finland and Sweden will enter into NATO membership gives essentially NATO control over the Baltic Sea in a way that it never had before, and a much longer border of NATO with Russia than the Russians had before. So again, we're balancing what these strategic gains are on each side, but I do believe that Russia continues to get the worst of the bargain, so to say.
And just before, I do want to talk more about Finland and Sweden joining NATO, but just on this question of the conflict itself, some people have been predicted, well, Russia could be defeated. When I was talking to General David Petraeus, who I'm sure you know, yesterday, he was saying that he felt that it was a bit too early to say that. And it does seem as though both sides are pretty entrenched. Do you think it is possible that Russia could be defeated in this war?
I think it is really going to be up, and I know probably a lot of people have said this to you too, but it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to decide what will be their victory in this war, because for Russia to be defeated, it will have to be a Ukrainian victory, right? So they are going to have to decide what they will accept for victory. We've heard them say they want to push the Russians off every inch of Ukrainian territory. Well, does that mean immediately, or does it mean putting that into negotiation and getting Russian troops off their territory now, and then working to restore their control over time on the territories of the Donbas, just as a way of example. So it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to articulate what victory means for them. Then we can say that Russia has been defeated.
And of course, at the moment, it's been difficult enough just to get talks to get the fighters out of the steelworks, let alone any wider negotiations.
Yes, and that is a real problem right now. We did have talks going on early on in the fight, early on in the invasion, but they have been on hold now. I do think, and I want to underscore, it does look like the Ukrainians are going for bigger gains than they had hoped for right at the beginning. They were fighting for their lives right at the beginning, and I think now they are actually fighting to clearly convey that their independence and sovereignty is something that is here for the long haul and cannot be challenged in the way the Russians tried to do with this invasion.
As you mentioned earlier, another big setback for President Putin was the decision by Sweden and Finland to apply to join NATO. Now, it may take some time for that to go through, but President Putin set out to try to prevent NATO expansion, and he's got completely the reverse. But there are difficulties here, aren't there? Because NATO has been pretty united until now. We've now got Turkey making it very clear that it is prepared to block their applications. And President Erdogan's been talking more about that today.
Yes, President Erdogan is definitely taking a very, very tough line, and he is a tough negotiator. I know that from my own experience as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Of course, it was my boss, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who was doing the talking with Erdogan, but I observed many times how tough not only he, but the Turkish delegation and really the foreign minister can be. So they are experienced, they're tough, they know what they want. I still believe that this is a negotiation that Finland and Sweden will be, making their case to the Turks. Probably there is something on the table that Erdogan wants. Perhaps it's not directly from the Finns and the Turks, but perhaps they want the decision from the U.S. about providing them with new F-16 fighter planes, just by way of example. So I think that there are probably a number of things that Erdogan wants, and he has the maximum leverage now, and he's going to use it to the hilt.
Yes, President Erdogan saying today that it will only, and all NATO countries, of course, have to approve an application. He's saying that Sweden and Finland's applications to join, they will only be allowed if there is concrete action, because Turkey seems to be concerned about the two countries' approach to the Kurds and their aspirations.
Yes, and Erdogan and the Turkish government have been very clear about that over the last week, expressing concerns about the Kurds being really even members of parliament in Sweden, he has said. But this is the case that Sweden and Finland have welcomed Kurds, and they are citizens now in many cases, or refugees in those countries. And so they have enjoyed the status and protection that comes from that. So it will be really, I think, a very delicate thing to figure out how to strike the balance between what will be some, no doubt, demands from Erdogan about the Kurdish organizations that he considers terrorist organizations, and what Finland and Sweden will be ready to offer up.
And when you look at the bigger picture, as you mentioned, if these difficulties are overcome and Sweden and Finland do join, there'll be this new 800-mile-long border between Finland and Russia. I mean, clearly, it would mean NATO including the military forces of both Sweden and Finland. It would be an enlarged and in some ways a strengthened bloc, but it would also provide a new commitment, a new potentially sensitive border to defend, wouldn't it?
Well, of course, and that's what is so ironic about this whole situation, that Putin said he wanted NATO actually to withdraw back to its 1997 borders before the Warsaw Pact countries entered. And instead, he has the two really, I would say, historical neutral states up in the Nordic bloc joining NATO. But I do want to stress Norway has been a NATO member in good standing since the beginning and is bordering right up against Russia as well. The Russians never seem to have much heartburn with that relationship. And in fact, President Niinisto of Finland spoke to President Putin at the weekend and was very clear with him about his concerns and his country's concerns about the security challenges that Russia is now posing as the reason to join NATO. And Putin actually reacted in a fairly, well, I'm not going to say relaxed way, but did not in any way exhibit threatening language such as I was expecting. So it seems from what has happened since also that the Russians are saying, as long as there is no new NATO infrastructure in these countries, well, we can swallow hard and take it.
We've also seen today the first war crimes trial in Ukraine. A Russian soldier accused of shooting dead a civilian has pleaded guilty. One of the papers here in the UK has a picture of Vadim Shishimarin, who's apparently 21 and has admitted killing an unarmed 62-year-old. This was very close to the beginning of the invasion. He's clearly a young foot soldier, and although this is a significant moment, it does also raise the questions about whether more serious commanders are actually going to be brought to trial.
Yes, it does. And I frankly do not know who the Ukrainians are holding in custody. They have quite a few prisoners of war, and not all of them, of course, would be subject to a trial for a war crime. I'm sure of that. But who they have, of what rank, I just don't have that information. I think the most important thing is that these cases all be prepared very, very carefully with very clear and well documented evidence, and that there be no sense that any of these trials are being railroaded, that these individuals are being railroaded through the justice system. So it seems that the Ukrainians are taking their responsibilities in this regard very seriously, but in terms of how high up they'll be able to get into the command structure or even into the political reaches of the Russian Federation, that I think is unclear at this point.
Yeah, and we know that the Ukrainian authorities, with help from the UK, the US and others, are compiling as much evidence as they possibly can of all the alleged war crimes that have taken place. But I mean, the key question everyone wants to know is, what are the chances of ever bringing President Putin to trial? That is clearly something that's going to be very difficult.
Well, of course, there's no question about it. But I think even having the investigation going on at some point, the international courts are of course, focused on this in The Hague as well. So having this kind of international investigation going on does shine a light on what has happened in this situation, the decision making, which, of course, the key decisions reside right at the top with President Putin. And so I do think it will be an opportunity to again shine a light on what happened here and really convey a clear message to autocrats as they may emerge, either exist now or may emerge around the world, that the world is watching.
Rose Gottemoeller, a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and a former United States Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Really great to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. Vadim Shishimarin admitted shooting a 62-year-old man a few days after the invasion began. He faces life in jail. The International Criminal Court is sending a team of 42 investigators, forensic experts and support staff to Ukraine. And in the meantime, the country has set up its own team to preserve evidence and help to bring future prosecutions about. Well, joining me now is Adil Haq, who is executive editor at Just Security. He's a professor of law and Judge John O. Newman Scholar at Rutgers Law School, and is the author of a book called Law and Morality at War. Great to have you with us, Adil. A very good evening.
Thanks so much, Carole. Thanks for having me.
What do you think of the importance of this trial that has now begun? We've seen this 21-year-old Vadim Shishimarin pleading guilty to shooting a 62-year-old man. What do you make of this case?
Well, it is the beginning of a long process of bringing war criminals to account for crimes committed in Ukraine. This is a young soldier who is apparently ordered to commit this murder. This is going to be the first in a process. Now that he has pled guilty, hopefully he is providing information about the superior who gave that order. And from there, the Ukrainians can hopefully establish a pattern of war crimes committed in occupied territory or areas where the Russian forces were moving through. So it's the beginning of working up the chain and hopefully holding higher and higher ups accountable.
And it is a sign of, despite everything that the country is going through, that Ukraine's police, investigators, legal system is actually really working to try to bring those who have committed or there's sufficient evidence that they should be tried for committing war crimes.
It's amazing. Ukraine's chief prosecutor has taken an incredible leadership role, and really the whole Ukrainian legal system has shown incredible resilience in the midst of this really existential attack on their state, and their commitment to law and to the rule of law and to international law has been incredibly impressive and frankly inspiring. And so we've really never seen this, where a state under attack is utilizing all its resources to document, to investigate, and to start the process of accountability while a conflict is still ongoing. It's really unprecedented.
But when you look at the picture, it's on the front page of one of the papers here in the UK, of this Russian fighter, Vadim Shishimarin. He's 21 years old. He looks younger. He claims that he was ordered to shoot to kill. He is clearly not somebody who was a significant figure in the command structure of this war.
Absolutely. And often this is how international criminal processes begin. They begin with someone who pulls a trigger, who directly commits torture against someone. It starts with the direct physical perpetrators and then works its way up. And so often the first trials are of someone who is young, who is a junior officer, who was not making policy decisions. But the hope is that once you get that initial conviction, once you get testimony, once you get hopefully an in-court confession, that builds the factual record, and then you can work your way up the chain of command and hopefully hold higher-ups responsible.
Yeah, indeed, because I guess if you've got somebody like this defendant pleading guilty, saying that he was ordered to shoot to kill, he's presumably in a position to give more evidence about the command structure, about the sort of orders that he was getting.
Absolutely. And not just the orders that he was receiving, but what were other units doing? Was there a pattern? Was there a policy? How was this communicated? Where did the directive or simply the encouragement to commit these types of crimes, where exactly did it come from? Can we identify directives from above, or was this a sort of culture of impunity that was allowed to go on where it should have been stamped out? That's the type of detail that hopefully the Ukrainians are starting to get, not only from him, but from the other prisoners of war who they have in custody.
So do you think that this could lead to senior commanders actually having to face justice, and indeed, for that matter, as many people have questioned or raised the question, what about Vladimir Putin himself? I know that's a slightly different matter, but do you think there is a prospect of him ultimately facing justice?
There is. The pattern with international criminal law has always been that at the beginning, things look hopeless. The dictator, the commander, they're in power, they seem invulnerable. How will we ever get our hands on them? But if you create the institutions and if you create the mechanisms, then you're prepared when they suddenly fall in your lap. When Milosevic falls, when Omar al-Bashir falls, when these people who seem untouchable suddenly become touchable, you already have the institutions in place to hold them accountable. So that's the hope. It's a bit of idealism, but it's also based on a historical pattern that we've seen since World War II, really, creating the mechanisms before we actually have access to the defendants.
And presumably the prospects of that ultimately happening at some stage are increased by the fact that you have got these trained investigators and forensics experts and so on there in the country helping the Ukrainian authorities to gather evidence.
Absolutely. And again, we've really never seen this where battlefield evidence is being collected and preserved and recorded in close to real time on such a large scale. And so the hope for accountability in that respect is stronger than it is in many other conflict zones, where often it takes investigators a lot of time to get access to essentially these crime scenes. And so that does create more of a prospect of success down the road.
Great to speak to you. Adil Haq, Executive Editor at Just Security. He's a professor of law, author of Law and Morality at War. Really interesting to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed.